The dust never settled in Crow's Hollow. It hung in the air like unspoken accusations, swirling around the weathered wooden buildings that lined the single main street. Sarah McKenna had learned to read that dust like others read the Bible. When it danced in spirals, trouble was brewing. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked past Henderson's general store. Through the smudged window, she could see Martha Henderson's pinched face tracking her movement, lips moving in what Sarah knew was gossip rather than prayer. "There she goes again," Sarah heard Martha whisper to her companion. "Walking to the woods like she owns them." Sarah's fingers tightened around the wicker basket in her hands. Inside lay the evening primrose and wild sage she'd gathered at dawn, herbs her grandmother had taught her to use for Mrs. Caldwell's arthritis and little Tommy's persistent cough. But in Crow's Hollow, knowledge was dangerous, especially when it came from a woman who lived alone. The wooden planks of the sidewalk creaked under her boots as she passed the saloon. 3 men sat on the porch, their conversation dying as she approached. Buck Morrison, the town's self-appointed sheriff, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Evening, Miss McKenna," he said, his tone carrying more warning than greeting. "Evening, Sheriff Morrison." Sarah kept her voice steady, her eyes forward. "Mighty strange how Mrs. Patterson's cow stopped giving milk right after you paid her a visit last week." Sarah stopped walking. The September air felt suddenly colder, and she could smell the coming rain in the clouds gathering over the mesa. "Mrs. Patterson asked me to look at her cow's infected udder. I gave her a poultice of comfrey and calendula. The infection cleared." "And the milk dried up," added Jim Foster, the blacksmith. His massive arms were crossed over his leather apron, his face darkened by more than just soot. "Cows stop giving milk for many reasons, Mr. Foster. Age, poor feed, stress." Sarah's voice remained calm, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Buck Morrison stood slowly, his hand resting on his gun belt. Not threatening, but visible. "Seems like a lot of strange things happen around you, Miss McKenna. Animals acting peculiar, weather changing sudden-like when you're out in those woods." "The weather changes because it's autumn in Arizona territory, Sheriff. Animals act peculiar because they're animals." Sarah shifted the basket to her other arm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Mrs. Caldwell is expecting her medicine." She walked away with measured steps, feeling their eyes burning into her back like brands. Behind her, she heard Buck's voice, lower now, but still audible. "Mark my words, boys. That woman's got the devil in her." Sarah's pace quickened despite herself. The wind picked up, whistling through the gaps between buildings, and she could swear it carried the sound of whispering voices. But voices had been following her all her life. Born Sarah McKenna, she'd come to Crow's Hollow 5 years ago, with nothing but a wagon, a horse, and knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood the earth's secrets. Her grandmother had warned her, "Knowledge makes people afraid, Sarah girl, and afraid people do terrible things." Now, at 23, Sarah lived in a small cabin on the edge of town, growing herbs and vegetables, healing those brave enough to seek her help while trying to ignore the suspicious glances and crossed fingers that followed her everywhere. She reached Mrs. Caldwell's modest house as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The elderly woman's face, lined with pain and years of desert sun, brightened at the sight of her. "Sarah, dear, come in before you get soaked." Mrs. Caldwell ushered her inside, glancing nervously down the street before closing the door. "How are you holding up? I heard Buck Morrison's been asking questions." "I'm fine, Mrs. Caldwell." Sarah set her basket on the kitchen table and began removing small, cloth-wrapped packages. "Here's your sage tea for the joint pain, and I brought extra willow bark. Steep it longer when the weather turns cold like this." The older woman accepted the packages with grateful hands. "You're an angel, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without your remedies. These old bones don't handle the damp weather like they used to." Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Through the window, she could see more people gathering on the street despite the rain. Their voices carried even through the walls. Angry, excited, dangerous. Mrs. Caldwell, Sarah said quietly. "Perhaps you should be careful about being seen accepting my medicines. People are talking." "Oh, let them talk." The old woman's voice carried surprising steel. "I know what you are, child, and what you aren't. You're a healer, just like your grandmother before you. There's no evil in that." A loud bang on the door made both women jump. Through the rain-streaked window, Sarah could see Buck Morrison's bulk, silhouetted against the stormy sky, flanked by several other men. "Mrs. Caldwell!" Buck's voice boomed. "Open up! We need to have a word with Miss McKenna." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Mrs. Caldwell's face went pale, but she moved protectively in front of Sarah. "You don't have to go with them," the older woman whispered fiercely. But Sarah knew better. In a town like Crow's Hollow, running only proved guilt. She straightened her spine, smoothed her skirts, and walked to the door. The rain hit her face like accusations as she stepped onto the porch. 6 men stood before her, their faces grim in the storm's grey light. Behind them, more townspeople gathered in the street, their voices a rising chorus of fear and anger. "Miss McKenna," Buck Morrison said formally, water dripping from his hat brim. "You're coming with us. The town council wants to ask you some questions." "What kind of questions, Sheriff?" "The kind that determine whether Crow's Hollow harbors a witch." The word hit her like a physical blow. Around them, the crowd's murmur grew louder, more agitated. Sarah saw faces she'd helped, women whose children she'd cured of fever, men whose wounds she'd cleaned and bandaged. Now they looked at her with suspicion and fear. "I'm not a witch," Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying over the rain. "I'm a woman who knows how to use plants for healing. Nothing more." "Then you won't mind proving it," said Reverend Walsh, stepping forward from the crowd. His thin face was severe under his black hat, his pale eyes cold as winter sky. "The Lord has ways of revealing the truth." Sarah's heart sank. She knew about the Reverend's ways. She'd heard stories from other frontier towns where fear had overtaken reason. As they led her through the muddy streets toward the church, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement on the hill overlooking the town. A lone figure on horseback sat silhouetted against the storm clouds, perfectly still, watching. She blinked, and the figure was gone. But something deep in her chest told her that her life in Crow's Hollow, perhaps her life altogether, was about to change forever. The church doors slammed shut behind her with a sound like a coffin closing. The inside of Crow's Hollow's church had never felt less holy. Candles flickered in the humid air, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls, while rain hammered the roof like an army of angry spirits. Sarah sat on a hard wooden chair in front of the altar, her hands folded in her lap, trying to project calm while her heart raced. The entire town seemed crammed into the small building. Men stood along the walls, their faces hard and unforgiving. Women clutched their children closer, whispering prayers or curses. Sarah couldn't tell which. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and fear. Reverend Walsh stood at the pulpit, his black-clad figure looming over the assembly like a carrion bird. In his hands, he held a worn Bible, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "we gather tonight not in celebration, but in sacred duty. For too long, we have allowed darkness to creep into our godly community." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah noticed how quickly neighbors had turned into accusers, how fear had transformed familiar faces into masks of suspicion. "Sarah McKenna," Reverend Walsh continued, pointing a bony finger at her, "you stand accused of practicing witchcraft, of consorting with dark forces, of bringing evil into our midst." "Reverend Walsh," Sarah said, rising from her chair. Her voice was steady, despite the trembling in her legs. "I've never harmed anyone in this town. I've only tried to help." "Help?" The word came from Martha Henderson, who stood near the front of the crowd. "You call it help? When my chickens stopped laying eggs after you walked past my coop? And what about my horse?" shouted Jim Foster. "Been acting spooked ever since you looked at him last month." More voices joined in, each person adding their own suspicions and fears to the growing list of accusations. Sarah listened in growing horror as perfectly normal events, weather changes, animal behavior, crop failures, were twisted into evidence of supernatural malevolence. "Silence!" Reverend Walsh's voice cut through the chaos. "We will proceed in an orderly fashion. Sheriff Morrison, present the evidence." Buck Morrison stepped forward, pulling a leather pouch from his coat. "We searched Miss McKenna's cabin while she was here. Found these." He opened the pouch and dumped its contents on a table near the altar. Sarah's breath caught. Her herbs, her carefully prepared medicines, her grandmother's journals, all laid out like instruments of evil rather than healing. "Devil's herbs," Morrison announced. "Dried bat wings, toad bones, nightshade for poison." "Those are medicinal plants," Sarah protested, stepping forward. "Willow bark for pain, sage for inflammation, chamomile for—" "Enough!" Reverend Walsh slammed his Bible on the pulpit. "We know what these are, woman, tools of your dark craft." Sarah looked desperately around the room, searching for a single friendly face. She found Mrs. Caldwell near the back, the old woman's eyes filled with tears and helpless rage. But Mrs. Caldwell was alone, one elderly voice against an entire town consumed by fear. "Let's test her," called out a voice from the crowd. Sarah turned to see who had spoken and felt her blood chill. It was Thomas Brennan, a man whose infected leg she'd saved from amputation just 6 months ago. "If she's innocent, God will protect her." The crowd's energy shifted, becoming more agitated, more dangerous. Sarah had heard of these tests, trials by ordeal, that were more torture than justice. "Yes!" Martha Henderson's voice was shrill with excitement. "Test her. If she floats in water, she's a witch. If she sinks and drowns, she was innocent." "Or we could see if she burns," suggested another voice. "Witches don't burn like normal folk." Sarah's mouth went dry. She looked toward the church doors, but they were blocked by men with grim faces and calloused hands. The windows were too high, too small. She was trapped. "Please," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd's growing hysteria. "Listen to yourselves. You're talking about murder. Mrs. Patterson, I helped deliver your youngest son. Mr. Foster, I sat with your wife when she had the fever. Mrs. Henderson, I gave you herbs to help you sleep when your husband died. Is this how you repay kindness?" For a moment, the crowd fell silent. Sarah saw doubt flicker across several faces, remembered humanity struggling against manufactured fear. Then Reverend Walsh spoke again, his voice low and poisonous. "The devil's greatest trick is to appear as an angel of light. She speaks of kindness, but her help comes with a price, your souls." The moment of doubt passed. The crowd's anger returned, stronger than before. "Burn her! Test her in the river! She's corrupted our children." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her. How many women had stood where she stood now? How many had died for the crime of being different, of knowing things that frightened small minds? Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. In the sudden silence that followed, a new sound reached them. Hoofbeats riding hard through the storm. The church doors burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. Rain and wind howled into the building, extinguishing several candles and setting the remaining flames dancing wildly. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall, powerful, and completely still despite the chaos around him. Water dripped from his long black hair and buckskin clothing. His dark eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with a single, calculating glance. Sarah's heart stopped. She had seen this man before, watching from the hills around town. Apache by his dress and bearing, but what was he doing here? "You will release her." His voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. He spoke English with only the faintest accent, each word precisely chosen and delivered. Buck Morrison's hand dropped to his gun. "Now just hold on there, Indian. This is town business. You got no call to—" The Apache's gaze fixed on Morrison, and the sheriff's words died in his throat. There was something in those dark eyes that spoke of dangers far greater than anything the townspeople could imagine. Mountains crossed alone, battles fought and won, a life lived without compromise or fear. "My name is Ayana," the Apache said, stepping fully into the church. "In your language, this means eternal blossom. I have watched this woman. I have seen her gather healing plants at dawn, seen her tend to those who suffer. She is no witch." Reverend Walsh found his voice. You're defending her. A heathen defending a witch?" Ayana's lips curved in what might have been a smile, but there was no humor in it. "I am defending what is mine." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah felt her knees go weak. "What do you mean, yours?" Buck Morrison demanded, though his hand stayed well away from his weapon. Ayana looked directly at Sarah then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race for entirely different reasons than fear, determination, protection, and something deeper, something that spoke of choices made and paths chosen. "She is my wife now," he said simply. The church erupted in chaos. Shouts of outrage, demands for explanation, the sound of chairs scraping as people surged forward. But through it all, Sarah could only stare at this man who had just claimed her life as his own. She should have been terrified. She should have protested. Instead, looking into Ayana's dark eyes, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The storm outside grew stronger, as if nature itself was responding to the drama unfolding within the small church. And in that moment, Sarah McKenna realized that whatever happened next, her old life was over. The question was, would she live to see her new one begin? The church had descended into pandemonium. Voices shouted over each other, some demanding answers, others calling for weapons. But through the chaos, Sarah found herself locked in a silent conversation with the Apache warrior who had just upended her world. Ayana stood perfectly still amid the storm of human emotion, his dark eyes never leaving her face. In them, she read a question that transcended words. "Will you trust me?" Her answer came without thought, rising from some deep place where instinct lived. She stood slowly and walked toward him, each step feeling like a choice between death and life. "Sarah." "No," Mrs. Caldwell's voice cut through the din. "You don't know what you're doing." But Sarah did know. She was choosing to live. Buck Morrison stepped between them, his face flushed with anger and confusion. "Now hold on just a minute. You can't just walk in here and claim—" "I claim nothing that is not already mine," Ayana said calmly. "She chose freely. 6 moons ago, when the cottonwoods turned gold, she came to the river alone. I watched her gather water plants for healing. She saw me watching and did not run, did not scream. She looked at me as one human sees another." Sarah's memory stirred. Yes, she remembered that day. The figure in the trees across the river, the moment their eyes had met. She had felt no fear, only curiosity about the solitary man who seemed as much a part of the wilderness as the deer and eagles. "That doesn't make her your wife," Reverend Walsh sputtered. "There was no ceremony, no—" "By whose law?" Ayana's question was quiet but devastating. "Yours? The law that would burn a woman for healing? Or the law of my people, where a man protects what he values?" Sarah reached Ayana's side and felt the warmth radiating from his body despite his rain-soaked clothes. Up close, she could see the intricate beadwork on his vest, the careful attention to detail that spoke of patience and skill. His face was younger than she'd expected, perhaps only a few years older than her own 23, but his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had faced life without illusions. "This is madness," Martha Henderson shrieked. "She's a witch, and now she's consorting with savages." Ayana's expression didn't change, but Sarah felt the subtle shift in his posture, the way a wolf might shift before striking. She placed her hand on his arm, feeling corded muscle beneath the buckskin. "No violence," she said quietly. "Please." He looked down at her, and something in his expression softened. "As you wish. But we leave now. "You're not taking her anywhere," Buck Morrison declared, finally finding his courage. "She's got to face trial, pay for her crimes." "What crimes?" Ayana's voice carried the patience of stone. "Healing the sick? Growing food? Walking in forests? If these are crimes in your world, then your world is sick." Thunder crashed overhead again, and several people jumped. Through the open church doors, Sarah could see the storm intensifying, rain driving horizontally across the town square. "The weather," someone whispered. "It's getting worse since he arrived." "It's October in Arizona," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Storms come whether there are Apache here or not." But she could see the fear spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Superstition and prejudice were combining into something dangerous. Reverend Walsh raised his Bible high. "We cannot allow this abomination. A Christian woman cannot marry a heathen." "I was never baptized in your church," Sarah said clearly, "and even if I was, I'd choose freedom over your kind of salvation." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Sarah felt a strange exhilaration. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path, instead of merely enduring others' choices for her. "You'd choose to live like an animal?" Martha Henderson demanded. "Sleeping in caves, eating raw meat, never seeing civilization again?" Sarah looked around the church, at the faces twisted with fear and hatred, at the comfortable cruelty of people who would burn her alive for being different, and then at the man beside her whose presence radiated calm strength. "If this is civilization," she said, "then yes, I choose to be free." Ayana stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell sage and wood smoke in his hair. "The choice is yours," he said quietly. "I offer protection, not imprisonment. Among my people, you will be honored for your knowledge, not persecuted for it." "Your people?" Buck Morrison scoffed. "What people? The Apache been driven off their lands, scattered to the four winds. You got nothing to offer her but starvation and—" "I offer her life," Ayana interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. "You offer her death. The choice seems clear." Sarah felt the truth of his words settle in her bones. She looked one last time at the faces in the crowd, people she had helped, healed, cared for. Not one of them met her eyes now, except Mrs. Caldwell. The elderly woman pushed through the crowd, moving slowly but with determination. When she reached Sarah, she pressed something into her hands, a small leather pouch that Sarah recognized as containing her mother's silver locket. "Go, child," Mrs. Caldwell whispered. "Live free, be happy." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. "Thank you for believing in me. I always did. Now go, before they work up courage for real violence." As if summoned by her words, Jim Foster stepped forward with several other men. "We can't let them leave. She's got information about our defenses, our weaknesses. What if she tells other Indians?" Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity. "Information about what? That you have 12 rifles and a cannon that hasn't fired in 5 years? That your biggest worry is running out of coffee beans?" But she could see the crowd's mood darkening further. Fear was transforming into aggression, and she knew how quickly that could turn deadly. Ayana sensed it too. In one smooth motion, he moved Sarah behind him and faced the crowd. "We go now. Anyone who tries to stop us will answer to me. There's 24 of us and 1 of you," Buck Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ayana smiled then, an expression that was all predator. "I have fought Comanche war parties and Mexican soldiers. I have survived blizzards that would kill you and walked through deserts that would cook your bones. Ask yourself, do you really want to test me?" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Rain continued to pour through the open doors, and lightning illuminated the scene in stark, dramatic flashes. Then Sarah stepped out from behind Ayana. "I'm leaving of my own free will," she announced. "No one is forcing me. This is my choice." She walked to the doors, Ayana beside her. The crowd parted reluctantly, muttering and cursing but making no move to physically stop them. At the threshold, Sarah turned back one last time. "I never did you any harm," she said. "I only tried to help. Remember that when you tell this story to your children." Then she stepped out into the storm, Ayana's hand warm and steady on her back. His horse waited in the square, a magnificent black stallion that stood calmly despite the wind and rain. Ayana mounted in one fluid motion, then reached down for Sarah. She hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the life she was leaving behind. The small cabin where she'd lived alone, the garden she'd tended, the simple, quiet existence she'd built from nothing. Then she grasped Ayana's hand and let him pull her up behind him. The horse moved immediately, carrying them away from the church, away from the town, away from everything Sarah had known. She wrapped her arms around Ayana's waist and felt the solid strength of him, the warm reality of her choice. Behind them, the voices of Crow's Hollow faded into the storm. Ahead lay the dark wilderness, unknown but no longer frightening. For the first time in years, Sarah McKenna felt truly alive. 3 days after leaving Crow's Hollow, Sarah woke to sunlight filtering through pine branches and the sound of water over stones. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory returned in a rush. The church, the accusations, the Apache warrior who had claimed her as his wife. She sat up carefully, expecting soreness from sleeping on the ground, but found herself lying on soft furs and woven blankets. A small fire crackled nearby, and the air smelled of sage and something cooking that made her stomach growl. "You wake like a deer," came Ayana's voice from somewhere behind her, alert but quiet. Sarah turned to find him emerging from the trees, carrying fresh water in a skin pouch and what looked like fish wrapped in leaves. In the daylight, away from the drama and fear of the church, she could really see him for the first time. He was tall and lean, with the kind of strength that came from a lifetime of living off the land. His black hair fell past his shoulders, held back by a band of worked leather. His face was angular, handsome in a way that spoke of good bones and honest living. But it was his eyes that captured her, dark as winter nights, but warm with intelligence and something that might have been humor. "I brought breakfast," he said, settling beside the fire, "river trout and wild onions." Sarah watched him work, his hands quick and efficient as he prepared the food. "Where are we?" 2 days' ride northwest of your town. Hidden canyon that my people have used for generations." He glanced at her. "Safe place to rest and talk." The word hung between them, heavy with implication. In the urgency of escape, they hadn't had time for conversation. Now, in the quiet morning light, the reality of their situation settled around them like morning mist. "You called yourself my husband," Sarah said carefully, "but we don't know each other." Ayana nodded, feeding small sticks to the fire. "In your world, this is true. In mine." He paused, choosing his words. "Among my people, marriage is not always about knowing someone's past. Sometimes it is about recognizing their spirit, and you recognized mine." He looked at her directly then, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I watched you for many moons, saw how you moved through the world with respect for growing things, kindness for creatures that suffered, saw how you bore the fear and suspicion of others with dignity. Yes, I recognized your spirit." Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, not fear, but something warmer and more complex. "Why did you help me?" "Because burning healers is a sickness of the heart." His voice carried old pain. "My grandmother was a medicine woman. When the soldiers came to our village, they called her a witch too, said her healing was devil magic. What happened to her? She died fighting to protect her medicine bundles. Her knowledge died with her." Ayana turned the fish carefully. "When I saw what your people planned for you, I could not let it happen again." The fish smelled wonderful, and Sarah realized she hadn't eaten since before the trial. Ayana wrapped portions in leaves and handed one to her, along with a cup made from a gourd. "What's in here?" she asked, sniffing the liquid. "Pine needle tea, good for strength after traveling." Sarah took a sip and found it surprisingly pleasant, earthy and clean with a slight sweetness. "You know healing too." "Some, but not like you." I saw the plants you gathered, recognized many of them. Your knowledge is deep. D. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the gentle murmur of the stream. Sarah found herself studying this man who had upended her life. There was something peaceful about him, a sense of being completely comfortable in his own skin that she envied. "What happens now?" she asked eventually. Ayana set down his empty leaf plate and looked at her seriously. "That depends on you. I spoke truth in the church. You are my wife if you choose to be, but the choice must be freely made, without fear or desperation. And if I choose not to be, then I will take you wherever you wish to go. My offer of protection stands regardless." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. When had anyone offered her such unconditional kindness? "Where would we live? You said your people were scattered." "Not scattered, hidden. We are not many, but we survive. My band lives in the high country, moving with the seasons. It is a good life, simple, but free." "What about white settlements? Other towns like Crow's Hollow?" Ayana's expression darkened slightly. "We avoid them when possible, when not possible." He shrugged. "We defend ourselves." Sarah understood. The Apache had been fighting for their survival for decades, pushed off their ancestral lands by an expanding nation that saw them as obstacles to progress. To join them would mean leaving the white world entirely, becoming an outcast in the eyes of her own people. But what people were those, really? People who would burn her for being different. "Tell me about your band," she said. "The people I would be living with." Ayana's face softened. "Good people. Strong women who would teach you our ways, children who would learn from your healing knowledge, men who would respect your wisdom." He paused. "My sister Nayeli leads the women. She is, how do you say, formidable, but fair. What would my role be? As your wife, I mean. Whatever you choose it to be. Apache women have great freedom. You could be a healer, a teacher, a gatherer of plants. You could learn to ride and hunt if you wished, or you could simply be yourself." The concept was revolutionary. In white society, a woman's role was rigidly defined: wife, mother, dependent. The idea of choosing her own path seemed almost too good to be true. "What about children?" she asked, then blushed at her own boldness. Ayana's eyes warmed. "If we are blessed with children, they would be raised Apache, free to run in the mountains, to learn the old ways. Would that trouble you?" Sarah thought of the children in Crow's Hollow, pinched with fear, taught to distrust anything different, bound by rules that crushed the spirit. "No," she said softly. "That wouldn't trouble me at all." They talked through the morning, as the sun climbed higher and painted the canyon walls gold and red. Ayana told her about life with his band, the seasonal migrations, the hidden camps, the careful balance of avoiding confrontation while maintaining their traditional ways. Sarah shared her own story, her childhood with her grandmother, the knowledge passed down through generations of healing women. As the day progressed, Sarah felt something growing between them. Not love, not yet, but understanding, respect, the foundation upon which something deeper could be built. "I need to ask you something," she said, as they sat by the stream in the afternoon heat. "Is this real, or am I just convenient, a way to save someone from injustice?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, trailing his fingers in the clear water. "When I was 12, I had a vision during my manhood ceremony. I saw a woman with hair like autumn leaves and eyes like mountain sky. She stood between two worlds belonging to neither. In the vision, she chose the world of wind and stone over the world of walls and fear." Sarah touched her auburn hair self-consciously. "You think I was the woman in your vision?" "I think visions show us possibilities, not certainties. But when I saw you that day by the river, when you looked at me without fear," he met her eyes, "I recognized something. Call it fate, call it chance. But I knew you were meant for a different life than the one they would give you." As evening approached, Ayana began preparing for another day's travel. They would reach his band's current camp by tomorrow night, he told her. There, The real test would begin, whether she could truly adapt to Apache life, whether his people would accept her. "Are you afraid?" he asked as they prepared their sleeping arrangements. Sarah considered the question seriously. "Of your people? No. Of leaving everything I've known? Yes." She looked at him across the fire. "But I'm more afraid of what my life would have been if you hadn't come." That night, as she lay on her bed of furs with Ayana a respectful distance away, Sarah stared up at the stars through the pine branches. They seemed brighter here, away from the settlement, closer to their ancient light. Tomorrow she would meet her new family. Tomorrow she would begin learning a new language, new customs, a new way of seeing the world. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but for the first time in her adult life, she was choosing her own path. She fell asleep to the sound of wind in the pines and Ayana's steady breathing, and dreamed of mountains that stretched to the horizon, calling her home.